uh, um, and a booster session. So really, this is designed to help you get some hacks to make the most of the reading comprehension section inside the verbal sections of both the GMAT and GRE. So super excited to be talking about this today. I'll share some tips, just general advice to really kind of maximize your effectiveness around reading comprehension. And then we'll go through an example together to help bring it to life. I would say like this is a pretty small group. There's 20 or a little over folks on the call. So anyone who's comfortable, like, feel free to turn on your video. It'd be great if you're willing to turn on your video. As well as like the more dynamic we can make this, feel free to come off mute, ask questions, or engage in the chat. I have Erica here as well, who's helping me with the chat. So would love to make this as interactive as possible, and really like to make it as helpful for you as possible. So this is your time, and want to help you get the most out of it to do well on reading comprehension questions. So, all right. Before we dive in, I'll just share a little bit of background about me. So I actually really enjoyed taking the GMAT. And I will say my favorite part by far was the verbal section, and actually, really enjoyed the critical reasoning and reading comprehension portions. And we'll talk about some of why in this session. But ultimately, after studying for a few months, I scored 770 on the GMAT and then got my MBA at Chicago Booth. I have previous experience at Goldman Sachs and BCG, primarily doing private equity, or what we call PIPE, which is private investment and private equity consulting, as well as enterprise transformation type work. So that's a little bit about my background. Maybe before we dive into the content, I would love to get to know you all a little bit better. If you want to drop in the chat where you're dialing in from, and maybe I'll ask you all whether you're team GMAT or GRE. All right, lots of GMAT. Oh, nice. Amazing. And Mary, GRE. Okay, awesome. Amazing. Cool. All right. So actually, decent spread. Hey, Ali, of both. So a few folks with GRE, maybe a little bit more GMAT. I will say, like, everything we talk about today applies across both. Yeah, super excited to have you all here. And let's dive into it. So reading comprehension, uh, the way this portion of the exam is structured, right, is you have a passage that you have to read that's usually incredibly convoluted and oftentimes about sort of complex or more scientific type projects or topics, and then you will have to answer a series of questions about it. Okay, and the questions range from, like, this one particular part of the passage, like what was the author saying, to higher level, like more meta type questions of like, what's the point of the passage? What's the author trying to accomplish? Um, so just to give you a few tips, um, about how to read the passage. So when you approach these types of questions, like when they come up, I would say very first, it's important to just read through the passage before reading any of the questions. So I get this question a lot in my coaching, is like, whether, is it helpful to like read the questions first or go straight to the passage? And in my experience, reading the questions first will then sort of bias your reading of the passage. So better is like cast those aside and focus on just reading the passage. And the goal is to understand the overall so what. Like, what is the author trying to say, right? So don't go super detailed into every section of the passage. It will take too long, and clearly it will just like use way too much of your time. So instead, you want to read for like, what's the main point, and really at the paragraph level, like for each of the paragraphs or 2 to 3 sentences, what is the author trying to communicate? Why is he or she bringing in this piece of information, and how does it relate to sort of the broader story that's being told? And another way to say that, as you can see, is like focusing on the structure, right? What's the structure of the argument that's being presented? I've had a lot of folks find it helpful to restate each paragraph in your mind as you read it. Um, and I've had some folks who prefer to write down a summary. I think this is fine early in your sort of practice if it helps you be rigorous in restating it in your mind. Um, but ultimately, you want to move away from this because, like, part of the game with these exams, right, is balancing speed with comprehension and accuracy. And so if you can get that message clarity in your mind, it's going to be a lot faster than writing it down on paper. So if upfront it's helpful for you to write it down on paper, great. But at some point, I would push you to transition to reading a few sentences and then restating in your mind, like what's the so what of what I'm reading here. Okay. The good news is that the passages are very predictable in their structure. Um, so they typically present an argument in some form. It could be, the author presents a historical argument and then introduces new facts to refute the historical argument, or it could be that the author presents, just makes a claim, makes an argument, and presents some facts to support it. Or it could be that the author explores two competing views, maybe presents an opinion, maybe doesn't present an opinion. Right? These are some of the different structures that you can expect. It's helpful to read through a few of these because it will just help you get a sense of like what's in scope, like what's really possible for these. Um, but generally, they're going to make an argument. They're going to provide evidence for the argument. They may also provide evidence to sort of refute it, and then they'll provide context and how it fits into the broader understanding of the particular topic at hand. So if you kind of understand those core elements that like are inputs to building the argument in the passage, it can help you identify, okay, what's this paragraph talking about? For example, maybe the first paragraph is introducing the topic. Maybe the second paragraph is casting doubt then on the topic that was introduced. You want to be thinking at that level, like what's the so what of sort of each of the different components of the passage. So let me pause there. Any questions from the group? And again, I would say like feel free to just come off mute and ask directly, or you can throw them in the chat if you're more comfortable. All right, we will press forward then. So there's two. Mary, your question. Both tests are written with the same process. The format. So yes, the format of the passages and the types of questions are very similar across both tests. Yeah, it's a great question. All right, there's two places that I see folks get caught up or hung up when they're reading through the passages, right? So if this was like like a regular novel or something a bit more interesting to read, then like really the comprehension question, like the exam questions, wouldn't be that difficult to answer, right? Where it gets difficult is sometimes they throw really like frustratingly long passages at you, uh, which is stressful because you're under time constraints, or they'll just kind of try to make the format of them complex. And so my advice here is, as much as possible, like try to get excited about the passage. Um, so I've read passages about like different types of like I mentioned, there are a lot of scientific ones, so different types of species, geology. Like there's tons of different types of topics, but you can just try to like learn something new, right? So the more you can sort of read it with a curious mind, um, the more you can understand the argument that they're making, and where there may be strengths in the argument or weaknesses to try to help evaluate it, which will help you answer the questions. As I mentioned before, like reps really goes a long way here. And then I would say the other thing is like, really don't, you want to find the right level of speed. Like don't push yourself to go so fast to where you're skipping over things. Like if you read something and you don't understand it, you can't keep going because there's going to be questions about that content, and it's going to be, once you've sort of biased yourself with the questions, it's then when you go back to the passage, if you didn't really understand it the first time, they structure the questions in such a way that it's going to feel really convoluted and very difficult at that point to go back and sort of parse through what the correct answer is. We'll talk in a second about how they structure the answer choices and how they sort of make them difficult. But the point I'll make here is just like in that initial reading, you really need to understand like the point, like the so what of the message. So do not skip over sections that you don't understand. It will just make your life harder. And at the end of the day, it will just consume more of your time later on down the road. The other point I'll make is when you hit a long passage, uh, really, whenever I hit them, honestly, it kind of made me happy because they correlate the number of questions with the length of the passage. And you have to go through the same process either way. So if it's a really short passage, like you still have to go through the sort of comprehension and understanding the structure and all the things, right? And if it's a longer one, you can go through and do that once and then like knock out a bunch of questions on the back end. So I wouldn't be deterred by passages that, feel really long. Just sort of have the mental stamina to go through that rigorous process with the same level of quality. And I promise you, like it will end up saving you tons of time on the back end. All right, the other way that they will try to make the passages complex is they'll just use words like very, technical words or like giant words that you've never seen and hope to never see again. And my advice here is to ask yourself, do you even need to know what this word means? Most of the time, you actually really don't. They're just throwing in, large names of species and things to try to make it seem like almost to try to kind of stress you out and make it seem like it's going to be really hard for you to understand the passage. Now, if you do need to understand the word, like it's a contextual word, where you're not comprehending the broader sentence because you're lacking understanding around this one word, then my advice would be to use context clues around it to try to understand its meaning, right? Whether it could mean that something is favorable or whether it's something that the author is shying away from. Oftentimes, you can sort of use the context around the word to get those clues. But I would say most of the time you see like a giant, just hideous word, I would oftentimes just like replace it with a simple kind of stupid word in my head, and then every time I saw it, I would just replace it with that. And honestly, that will make reading the passage feel a lot more straightforward. Elliot, question in the chat here. Any tips on reading fatigue? By end of exam and long passages, I feel like I'm reading the words rather than comprehending it and end up rereading sections. So thank you so much. That's an excellent question, right? And I would say something that I think we all, anybody who's sort of done these has experienced. I think two pieces of advice, right? I think one is just the more of these you do, the more of that mental stamina you will start to be able to build up. And then I would say the other is to follow a very rigorous process around how you approach the passage and how you sort of break it down into straightforward language that you do understand. So if I can go back, like I'll go back to this previous slide. This bullet right here of like restating each paragraph in your mind to solidify the key message, as well as sort of thinking about how the different paragraphs connect to each other. How is the author constructing an argument? I think if you can simplify it to those two pieces of information, that's really all you need. So it could be that you're getting or feeling fatigue because you're reading almost too deeply in your initial pass. And so I will reiterate the point, like you, for detail level questions where they're going to ask about a particular sentence, if you feel like you know the answer before going back to the passage, you're probably like trying to comprehend too much in the first pass. Really, it should be about like what is the point of the passage and how is the argument presented? Is it like here's the conclusion and then the 3 points that are supporting it are in paragraph 1, 2, 3, or like what is that overall structure? And that's really it for the first pass. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Great question. Any other questions at this point? Otherwise, next we'll actually pull one up and we'll go through the process together. All right, let's do it. So here's a passage on the left. So I will ask you to first read the passage, and then read the 3 questions, and ask yourself if you can answer all 3 of them based on your understanding from the passage. So I'll pause for a minute here. Give it like 15 more seconds. All right, Alexander, love the summary, 100%. For other folks, like I will say, if the words celestial bodies or accretion, uh, scare you, feel free to simplify it even further. Um, but yeah, I think that's a perfect articulation, Alexander. Um, yeah, so you're exactly right, right? Exactly right. All right, so let's walk through how I broke this down, okay? Just to give folks an example. Uh, so this this kind of broader idea of like the first sentence, I submit that impact of solid bodies is the most fundamental of interstellar processes that have taken place on the terrestrial planets. Without impact, Earth, Mars, Venus, and Mercury would not exist. So this is like a giant sentence. That's like the first time I read this passage, I had to read it like 3 times. When I read the word bodies, I didn't think we were talking about like interstellar pieces of mass, but like bodies, human bodies. So like it, and this is not uncommon, right? Where they will, use like very diverse sort of advanced vocabulary. So just to sort of make it difficult to kind of comprehend, like it's easy to get that reading fatigue where you're just like, I do not care, right? So the more you can kind of have interest in the passages I mentioned, and like really breaking it down, right? So the passage is talking about solid bodies running into each other. This is responsible for the existence of a bunch of planets. The collision of objects creates the planets. It's self-erasing, uh, as it says, is the process of self-erasing. That makes it hard to observe, right? The record of the process has been preserved because there's a few, the moon, Mercury, and Mars, they're still going on, right? And then they mention that it's going on at a slow rate. The fact that it's still occurring in those three examples, probably more, right? But they provide those three examples and say the fact that that's still occurring means that we can actually study it. We can understand it better, right? If it weren't occurring in planets that we were able to observe, then we wouldn't be able to answer questions, like we wouldn't know what we know about planets' origins. That's like, to me, that's sort of the breakdown of the passage, right? Um, any questions about sort of how I broke this down, or you can see how Alexander and Mary did it as well. Um, Mary, love your articulation as well. Any other thoughts from the group? Hopefully you can see on the right hand side here, how this can help simplify, like simplify sort of that initial reading comprehension phase, right? So, and to be clear, if I were doing this in an exam setting, like I would not be writing the stuff on the right hand side down. I would just be restating it in my mind, right? So if I sort of understand the overall structure and the points that the author is making, and then, if I were asked about a specific part of the passage, I would need to go back and sort of validate it. But I kind of understand the main point. Okay, Elliot, should we be thinking about main points or author's purpose at this point, even without seeing the questions? So that's a great question. I would say the two things that you called out are the two things you should be thinking about at this point. So what are the main points, and what is the author trying to achieve, right? So like in this passage, there's like a meta theme as well, that's like, okay, the author is sort of making this claim that were we not able to observe it, we wouldn't know how it works today, and it's a good thing almost that we can observe it because the self-erasing nature would make it otherwise impossible, right? This one is more of like a list of facts, call it. Um, there are other ones that are more, we'll talk about how the judicial system has changed over time, or how equality, voting rights and things have evolved over time. And then they will make arguments about how, like, in this decade people thought one thing, and then that was this new piece of evidence was identified that changed the perspective. And so sometimes, like, those meta um, themes will be more important. But to answer your question, really, the answer is both. You want to, because they go hand in hand. You want to understand, like, what are the main points, and then what's sort of the so what of how those points fit together. Does that answer your question, Elliot, or not fully? And you're right. Like this. Okay, awesome. This is before you even review any of the questions, right? Just to be clear. All right. So now we've gotten to this point in the process. We've invested some time up front, and we understand the general structure. Now we get to the fun part of, like, answering the questions. And I will say, if you've done this first half rigorously, and by rigorously I mean you understand the structure, you understand the key themes. Not every detail, right? To be clear. But if you've done that rigorously, then this back half is gonna be a breeze. Okay. All right. There is a step that I can't tell you how many clients, like I will say this, and then in working with clients, they continue to struggle with it. So I would challenge yourself on this point, but there is a critical step of just understanding the question before you try to answer it. So similar to how they sort of structure the passages, they will also try to dress up the question and maybe ask it in a unnecessarily difficult format. And so again, right, you want to try to just simplify it to like, what are they actually asking, right? I can promise you that if you don't understand the question, it's going to be very, very difficult to answer it correctly. And so the first step is you have to hold yourself accountable to your own sort of do you know exactly what they're asking, right? Uh, then you want to review the passage to identify where it talks about the question. You can do this based on keywords in the question, but I would also caution you, oftentimes the correct answer will pull context from other parts of the passage. So if you didn't understand it in that initial reading, and then they reference a word and you're like, oh, I remember that word, and you go back and reread that sentence, oftentimes that will not give you all the context you need to successfully answer the question. So this gets back to why that initial reading is so important. Um, I I strongly would advise that, don't answer the question without reviewing the passage. This will enable you to go through that initial reading at the right level of depth. And oftentimes I know the answer, like almost the next point on here, right? Of like paraphrasing the correct answer before reading the answer choices. If you've done that initial reading well, oftentimes by like if you read the question that they're asking and you have a good you feel like you understand it well, oftentimes like in your head you're like, I know this is the answer. And then it's more validating the passage, just a quick like check the box, and then reading through each of the answer choices and checking them off, right? You want to review all the answer choices, even if you've identified the correct one, because sometimes they will lead with a 80% correct answer, and then the back little bit will have a portion that is incorrect. And so if you're going too quickly, you may select that answer thinking that it's correct, when in fact it's not. Now, if you had reviewed them all, then you would have found another one and you would have said, oh yeah, that one's true too. And then it causes you to look at them both more closely and identify which one is wrong. Okay. Um, so you always want to review them all. And oftentimes you can check off, if you've done again that initial reading really well, oftentimes you can check off 3, sometimes even 4, and it's easy to kind of quickly select the right one. Okay. If you're deciding between 2 answer choices, ask yourself which one is completely correct. Now one point I want to make here is there is not, this is true for the critical reasoning and it's true for the sentence correction. There are never 2 answer choices that are correct and one is more correct. Okay. Four of the answer choices will be wrong every time for one reason or another. And then there is only one that is correct. And so as you start to understand how they make them wrong, and you can build some intuition around that, it will become very clear, like what is just simply, out of scope for what they would consider to be a correct answer. And I'll give you some examples in a minute here. So again, this last point, right? As you follow this approach, you'll begin to understand why wrong choices are wrong, and this will help you build speed and accuracy in the exam. So as you're preparing, like I would really focus on that why, right? When you're going through the 4 and you're checking them off, try to categorize them into like, oh, this is this type of wrong, and that will just help you like build reps and identify the patterns more quickly. Okay. The good news is they're wrong in very consistent ways. Okay. So one is they just say something that's like flat out wrong, like from a fairly basic understanding of the passage, like there's no way. This one will show up on like some of the lower, with the focus edition, like it's more like the 500 type level questions, I'll say. The next is they use words in the passage but twist the meaning. So this gets back to like if your initial understanding wasn't quite correct, or you didn't go back and look at the passage, the portion that related to the question, uh, or even misunderstood the question, didn't fully understand it. When you start seeing words in the passage and they kind of relate to what you think the question is asking, and now you're kind of confused. Oh, and by the way, the clock is ticking. So you sort of like select the one that you think, relates and is most likely it. Okay. Like that will get you in trouble a lot. So you want to be thoughtful about like what is the answer choice really saying, and does it answer the specific question that's being asked? Okay. Another example that's very common is they will state the exact opposite of what the passage said. Which again, if you don't fully understand what the author was saying, then the fact that it relates and it has a lot of the same words, it'll feel really good. When in fact it's the exact opposite. Okay. Another common one is they will provide a true answer based on the passage, but it doesn't actually answer the question that's being asked. So this really gets down to if you misunderstand that question, even if your initial reading of the passage was very thorough and you understood the content fairly well, you may look at this answer choice and say, oh yeah, that was substantiated in the passage. Maybe it feels like it relates to the question, but it's not answering their question. That would be wrong, right? Another one that they will do is they will sort of try to appeal to your emotion, where they will state something that you would generally find to be true, but wasn't discussed or proved, or even is just completely out of scope, right? Not at all in scope with what was presented in the passage. So you want to make sure that it was presented in the content that you read, right? And then, as I mentioned, probably the hardest one, as you start getting to more advanced questions, this will become more common, which is where everything will be right except for one little piece will be out of place. And so if you don't have a really good understanding, uh, you can select those in error. So two tips. Like one is to write your own answer before reviewing the answer choices. That will help, or even in your mind, try to state your own answer before reviewing the answer choices. And then the second is, I'll just reiterate the point of review every answer choice, right? Even if you feel like you read one and you're like, yeah, that's it. For completeness, like check off the other ones, right? Your goal is really about eliminating as many as you can and identifying which ones are left, and then looking for these types of errors in those remaining answer choices to help you narrow it down. So let me pause here before we go to any examples. I have some examples from the passage that we all just read. Any questions about the types of answers, the types of questions, or sort of how to evaluate them? All right, let's dive in. Oh, yeah. I forgot this. So one thing to be mindful of, right, is there's three very common question types I'll just call out. Maybe some folks are familiar with these already, but for folks that aren't, there's a purpose of the passage, which is like, why did the writer present this passage, right? You need to this. Oftentimes they will present an answer choice that has some parts of the passage, but doesn't really like isn't comprehensive in its description of like each of the different points. So every paragraph, every point that the author makes should fit into the correct answer choice of the purpose of the passage. The second is detail questions. They'll ask for about a specific word or a specific sentence. On the GRE, it's common for them to ask like for a bold. They'll do like a boldface or two boldface sentences, and then say, what's the primary purpose of this boldface sentence. Um, so here, like having that initial context will be helpful, and then you can go back and again review the specifics of the question in detail. And then the last is inference questions, and like this is probably the one that's we're spending the most time on here, which I will say is here the author is going to imply something with near certainty, and the trick with these is, when the test writers say inference, what they mean is you really should be able to make this argument with all the facts that were presented in the passage. Okay. So there shouldn't be any significant gaps in the argument uh, in order for you to be able to infer this. Like one common format that they use is they basically say something that the author said, but rephrase it. You like say it in different words. So it's like it's impossible to sort of disagree with it because the author made that explicit point just with different language. That's probably the most rudimentary version, but is quite common. But there are more advanced sort of versions where you have to kind of take content from a couple of different sentences, but it should feel like a very straightforward argument that would be, basically impossible to poke holes in, if you took all the information as in the passage as truth, if that makes sense. Um, so the most common wrong answers, as I mentioned, would include statements that, and in more advanced types of questions here, they will take ones that again sort of appeal to your intuition. There are things that are very likely to be true, but not 100% must be true, sort of based on the set of facts that the author has provided in the passage. All right, Elliot, your question. Can you show about timing, say a 3-question passage? How long should it take for reading and answering? What a good way to learn the internal clock of time becomes intuitive. So that's an excellent question. I would say, so for you probably want to spend about 6 minutes total for like a 3-question passage. And I would say like 4.5 to 6 minutes. So 6 minutes as you're kind of getting used to this, and then ideally, like really reading comprehensions questions, uh, they end up being sort of time gimmies once you get good at it. To be honest, um, uh, and I would say in terms of the distribution of time, it depends a bit on like how much time you need to invest to get that first pass right. But roughly, I would say if you were going to do it in, uh, we'll say 4.5 minutes. Like if you were doing it perfectly, I would say like 2.5 minutes to understand the passage, 30 seconds per question, and then like 30 seconds kind of buffer wherever you need like a little bit more time would be my recommendation if you were doing it like super tight. Um, so really it's like, maybe to answer your question like a bit more broadly, it would be like 50 to 60% of the time is in that initial pass, and then 40 to 50% of the time is in reading the question, uh, quickly validating where in the passage, uh, and then reading each of the answer choices, checking off either all four and circling, or checking off 3 and then having a couple to evaluate. And that process, like as you practice, it will get pretty fast. Any other questions from the group? Awesome. All right. So let's jump in. So here's the first question. So I'll let you read it and then review the answer choices. Mary, I'll get to your point as well here in a sec. All right. So maybe just before we dive into the question and answers, Mary, to your point, like appreciate you sharing this. I would say, um, I think like what you voiced is something that I think a lot of folks struggle with, right? Which is just like sort of time management and balancing that with reading comprehension as a struggle in general, and then you throw on very complex, convoluted passages, then like it doesn't help your anxiety levels at all. Um, I think my piece of advice would be, uh, you know, practice this. I think practicing with a coach, like getting some direct support on the uh, like on the process can help quite a bit. To be honest, Mary, like what I would say is this is not it's not like general reading comprehension. Like there's a very rigorous sort of process that you can take, that what I'm describing here. Like if you follow each of these steps and you do it well, um, time will not be an issue. So I would focus on sort of, like hitting all the correct steps first. And like don't worry, like almost don't worry about time as you're sort of practicing. I think where a coach can be helpful also is like holding you accountable for each of the steps, as well as sort of helping make sure you're kind of investing in the right areas across the process. um, and once you like at some point as you're sort of practicing and getting really solid feedback, it's going to click for you. And I think when that moment comes, like you're going to find that time will be your best friend on these ones. All right. The author suggests that at least some of a number of difficult problems can be understood by extrapolating from observable phenomenon, anticipating the results of the collision of small bodies, studying the rate of accretion of planets, observing the internal process of planets, discounting the dynamics of how orbits change over time. All right. So hopefully you all have correct answer in your mind, or you've written down on your paper. So the correct answer to this one is A. Extrapolating from observable phenomenon, right? This passage really is talking about how we understand a number of problems because we can observe them in those three planets that were mentioned, right? Anticipating the results of the collision of small bodies. It doesn't talk about anticipating outcomes, right, at all in the passage. Studying the rate of accretion in planets. This is one where this is mentioned in the passage. So this is a good example, right, of something that like was mentioned, was in scope. And if you didn't fully understand either the question or exactly what you were reading, it might feel tempting. But at the end of the day, the rate of accretion of the planets has nothing to do with a number of difficult problems that we're trying to understand, right? But observing internal processes of planets, again, like that's something that they reference, uh, um, but isn't sort of what necessarily like why we can understand a number of difficult problems, right? And then discounting the dynamics of how orbits change over time. The point of like orbits changing over time is briefly mentioned, but it's like fairly out of scope for the passage. All right, I have two more here. So let's take a look at this. So this is a good inference one that for us to practice here. So I'll pause for a sec so you can read it. All right. It can be reasonably inferred that which of the following accounts for the lack of geological record concerning the history of impacts on the planets. So the correct answer here is C, a process of change in planets themselves. And this, if I show you here, so let's just go through them one by one. the violence of the initial impact, right? Very out of scope. Like it's not really discussed, right? An outcome that is not self-erasing. So this is a good example of like the exact opposite, right, of what the passage says. Right here it says, as the process is self-erasing. So it's just the exact opposite, right? A process of change in planets themselves. So this is a good example of what I was describing of of sort of restating uh, uh, what's in the passage to the point that like you basically can't disagree with it, right? Uh, because they're talking about how these collide together to form the planet, right? And then how that process is self-erasing. And that without sort of all of these other things going on inside, even if all these other melting and internal evolution had not occurred, you still wouldn't be able to see it, right? Because there's this process that's self-erasing, right? And that process would have to occur inside the newly formed planets, sort of based on all the context in the passage. And so it's a good example of something that, based on sort of the set of facts that the author has presented, like C absolutely has to be true. There's no jump in logic there, right? Like the process of change couldn't occur in another planet. It couldn't occur outside of the planets, right? So it's a process of change that occurs inside the planet itself. Uh, the absence of proof relating to a hypothetical collision. So there's discussion about sort of how we prove it, right? But we actually uh, have proof from these three examples, and also like the hypothetical collision is a bit troubling as well, based on the way that the author has presented it. And then the ongoing process of accretion, which another, like again, this is another one where like it's in there. If you feel good about it, it's easy to, it might feel tempting if you don't really know what the passage is talking about. So any questions on this one, or sort of inference questions in general? This is one that I will say folks struggle with, and I've spent a decent amount of time with clients on. So any questions about these kind of generally? All right, we'll hit the last one. I'll give you a second to read it here and then we can discuss. So this one is more about sort of those the higher level themes, right? What's the purpose of the passage? I won't read the answer choices since you all just read them, but the correct answer here, right, is it underscores the importance of an astronomical process and describes ways in which we can understand this process. So if you look at the others, prevents evidence that argues against a common misconception in the formation of planets. It doesn't really, the passage doesn't talk about there being a misconception with this, right? Um, undermine a claim regarding the role accretion plays in planetary evolution. It's not undermining a claim about the role that accretion plays, right? There's no attempt to sort of undermine a claim about that. Though I think they really want you to select something with accretion based on the answer choices here. Um, argue for the importance of using existing planetary conditions to understand prior cosmic occurrences. Um, so it doesn't argue for using existing planetary conditions, right? Uh, uh, to un, to understand prior cosmic occurrences, and then discuss how, unless immediate action is taken, astronomers will squander. This is clearly out of scope, right? It's not talked about in the passage. All right. So you're right, Mary. So I think you're right. Like C and D are the closest here. Um, and maybe just to like elaborate a little bit more on C, right? I think the problem here is uh, it's not comprehensive of the purpose of the passage, is what I would say. Um, so the passage does talk about this, but it's not like like again, to my original point on these, you want to think about from start to finish, like what summarizes every piece of it, right? Uh, Here it's introducing this astronomical process, how it's still occurring, and how it's important that it's still occurring because it helps us understand the process better. If it wasn't still occurring, we wouldn't be able to understand it, or if it wasn't occurring on planets that we could observe, right? So that's why that's important. Um, how difficult would you say these reading comprehension questions were? At what level? It's a great question. So these, I would say, are um, I would say these are like maybe like hard. I'll say not uh, the super straightforward ones, and maybe not like the top kind of ones you would get in like 98th, 99th percentile. Um, but probably like 90th to 95th or 90th to like 97th kind of percentile range. Yeah. So you bring up a great point too. You all hear about like understanding like a particular word. I think that can be a challenge, right? If there's a particular word in the answer choice that you're not sure on. I would say again, like your best friend here is elimination. So it's like if you can really evaluate sort of C and D from like a completeness perspective, um, uh, oftentimes you can select the one that has even if it has like words you don't fully understand. Like again, like I don't know that you even necessarily need to know how underscore fits in or what it means uh, um, to see that it's like comprehensive of the passage from what they've laid out. But it's a good point. It can be a challenge as well. Any other questions or thoughts from the group on this? All right, a few things to remember. Invest in verbal. It has the potential to really boost your score. And I would say like the muscle that you need for reading comprehension and critical reasoning is really quite similar. And so it can really help to sort of like build that muscle. When it comes to reading comprehension, always read the passage first. Take the time to really understand the meaning before you review the questions. If you review the questions first, it's easier to get a bit lost. Learn how the test writers are consistently wrong, and then build your intuition around spotting those types of wrong answers. Never, ever, ever, ever skip portions of the passage that you don't understand. Read it again. If you find your mind wandering, like stop and go back and really hold yourself accountable. Um, and if you're struggling with this, like this is where like connect with a coach, go through it together, practice this process of like really being rigorous in your mind about holding yourself accountable to really understanding the meaning before you dive into the answering portion, and it will significantly help you, I promise. Um, and then know the main types of questions and what must be true in the correct answer. And then from there, it really comes down to practice and just getting the reps and building some intuition. And you'll find that both your speed and accuracy will improve significantly from there. So that's it. That's it for me. Thanks for joining. I can stick around if anybody has any last minute questions or anything else that would be helpful to discuss. Yeah, thanks for joining. Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, everyone.